Good afternoon, everybody, and welcome to the Climate Security Network speaker series featuring today Mr. Mike Clancy. My name is Kristen Fletcher. I'm one of the leads on the Climate Security Network, and I'm with the Energy Academic Group at the Naval Postgraduate School. I am going to take a few minutes to just give you a few reminders and talk a little bit about our format, and then I'll introduce Mike. So the Climate Security Network is planning a COP26 panel in about a month for either November 17th or 18th at noon. So be on the lookout for updates on that. Also, we've updated the resource page on the CSN website with a lot of the climate documents that were issued last week from a number of different US government agencies. There were strategies and risk assessments. So I'll put the link in the chat once we get started. So for today, we are recording today's presentation. We'll post it on the CSN website in the coming days. And Mike Clancy will speak for about 40 minutes, and then we'll open it up for discussion. We do ask that you, and I think most of you have already done it, which is great, ask that you mute yourselves and turn off your videos during the presentation. So once we start the Q&A, we have a relatively small group, so we'll allow folks to turn those back on so we can have discussion at that point. Feel free during the presentation to type questions in the chat as we go, and I'll draw in part from those during the Q&A as we get that kicked off. You have Mike's bio in the flyer, so I won't spend too much time on it, but I did want to note just a few things. He has a BS in oceanography and an MS in meteorology. He joined Fleet Numerical Meteorology and Oceanography Center, which we all know as FNMOC, right here in Monterey in 1983, and he served as the technical and scientific director of FNMOC starting in August of 2005. He received the Navy's highest civilian award prior to his retirement in 2011. And it's just an honor to hear about the Morro Bay offshore wind farm and wind energy in general through the lens of your expertise, Mike. So thanks for being with us today. And with that, I will turn the floor over to you.
Thanks so much, Kristen. I really appreciate you setting this meeting up for me today. And I also want to acknowledge Jeff Paduan, who kind of got this thing going as well. So I'm going to now share my screen and jump right in with my slides. And we will start with a quick outline of what we're going to be talking about today. And let's see here. Hang on a second. All right, so here's a quick outline. Very quickly, I'm going to talk a little bit about climate change to motivate the need to move to clean energy. Then I'll go ahead and get into the technology of offshore wind power. That's kind of the heart of the talk. A little bit about the specifics of the planned Morro Bay wind farm. I'm going to probably move pretty quickly over the issues of concern. I'll just mention them briefly. I've got a lot of material on that, but probably not enough time to talk about it. But we can come back during the Q&A session if you want to and get into that in more detail. So let's jump right in on climate change and the need to move to clean energy. There's an overwhelming international scientific consensus on these 3 points. Stated simply, it's happening. Humans are causing it, and it is not a good thing. Now, there isn't a legitimate science organization in the world that would disagree with these 3 points. It's happening, humans are causing it, and it is not a good thing. So what are the impacts of climate change? Well, I'm just going to hit the high points here. Increasing frequency and intensity of severe storms, life-threatening heat waves, floods in wet regions, droughts and wildfires in dry regions like our region, decreasing mountain snowpacks and earlier snow melt, big issue for California since we get much of our summertime water supply from snow in the Sierra, rising sea levels, increasing mortality of coral reefs, decreasing productivity of fisheries, loss of biodiversities. So these consequences in the natural world immediately translate into impacts on the human world. And again, I'm just going to hit the high points: increasing economic costs, increasing competition among nations for water and food, increasing displacements of people, leading to unrest, increasing threats to human health, increasing mortality from heat waves, other severe weather events, starvation, disease, and war. Not a pretty picture. And also a picture that has many implications for the Department of Defense, many implications for the US Navy. So what are the greenhouse gases that are causing this problem? Well, it's carbon dioxide, methane, the fluorinated gases, nitrous oxide. And on the right-hand column, the approximate contribution to the current rate of global warming caused by these greenhouse gases. What you can see from this, CO2 is in the atmosphere is the dominant driver of global warming. Doesn't mean we don't need to worry about the other greenhouse gases. We do, they are a threat, but CO2 is the main culprit. So let's take a look at CO2 in the atmosphere. This is a plot of CO2 concentrations in the atmosphere from over this period of time. And what you see is that from the pre-industrial level, CO2 has increased by about 50%, was about 280 parts per million in the pre-industrial era. And now it's running at about 419 parts per million, the highest level in the past 3 to 4 million years. From 1850 to 2018, the total amount of CO2 emitted by human activities amounted to about 1.6 trillion tons, and about 0.9 trillion tons is still there above the pre-industrial level. Basically, we're putting CO2 in the atmosphere about 2 to 3 times faster than the natural world can take it out. And as a result, the CO2 concentrations are going up exponentially. We're currently putting through human activities, about 40 billion tons of CO2 per year into the atmosphere. So where all is that CO2 coming from? Well, mainly from China, followed by the United States and India, and goes on down from there. China and the US together account for about 40% of greenhouse or CO2 emissions. China is clearly number one. But before you get too mad at China, why wouldn't they be number one? They're the world's most populous nation. And another way of looking at it is to look at per capita emissions. And when you do that, China drops pretty far down the list, kind of comparable to a European country. And the US is number one. The average American puts 16.5 tons of CO2 into the atmosphere every year, but we're followed pretty closely by Australia and Canada. So obviously the US has a role to play here. So where is the CO2 produced by the US coming from? Well, it's mainly from these 3 sectors: transportation, electrification of the power grid, and industrial production, mainly steel and cement production. Well, the topic today really is focused on electricity generation. So let's take a look at that in more detail. In rough round numbers, I've rounded these to the nearest 10%. Here's where the energy is coming from that electrifies our power grid. Number one is natural gas, about 40%. And then it's pretty equally distributed between coal, nuclear, and renewables, totaling to about 0.5 terawatts. That's the amount of power flow we have now on the US power grid. So let's take a closer look at the renewables. Wind is number one, 8.4%, followed by hydroelectric, solar, biomass, and geothermal. So about 8.4% of the energy electrifying the power grid is currently coming from wind. And that actually amounts to about a little more than 40 gigawatts. The vast majority of that wind power is onshore wind power. More than 99% is onshore wind power. The offshore wind power, which is the topic at hand today, is very small, less than 1%. But we're looking to grow that. And there's a lot of resource out there. So that's where that's kind of the context. And now we're going to jump in on the topic of offshore wind power. Now I want to begin by showing you this map of wind resource in the US. And what you see here is that there's a lot of wind resource off all 3 coasts within our 200-mile exclusive economic zone, our EEZ. Also, offshore wind turbines have the advantage of being much larger and therefore more efficient than their onshore counterparts, and they benefit from the stronger and more consistent winds over the sea. In fact, if fully developed, the offshore wind power available to the US along our 3 coasts would produce about twice as much electricity currently available on the US power grid. So there's a lot of wind resource out there. Now, the Biden administration has a goal of achieving 30 gigawatts of offshore wind power by 2030 and has announced a total of 7 possible lease sales across all 3 coasts by 2025. One of them, of course, is the Morro wind farm. So let's start by looking at some terminology. This is what a typical offshore wind turbine looks like. This is the blade. The blades come together at the hub. This structure here is called the nacelle. This is the tower, the deck, the substructure, and it can be several different forms. The deck here The air gap refers to the space between the bottom tip of the blade and the sea surface. And this is called the rotor, basically the area that's swept out by the blades. Now let's take a closer look at the nacelle. There are meteorological instruments on the top of the nacelle. They measure wind speed and direction. And as the wind direction changes, there is a yaw system. There's an electric motor which actually rotates the turbine to face into the wind. So an electric motor does that. There's also a pitch adjustment system that, based on wind speed, adjusts the pitch of the propeller. So these these blades actually twist just like a propeller on an airplane. And this is the generator. Now, the offshore wind turbines we're talking about for Morro Bay project, the ones that are kind of the latest generation, they will use what's called direct drive generator. A direct drive generator is highly efficient, very nice because it doesn't involve any gears, very few moving parts. Basically, it's a big drum, and the interior part of the drum remains fixed, does not turn, and there are coils of copper wire there. The outside rim of the drum does turn as the blades turn, and it includes very, very powerful permanent magnets. These are kind of arrayed longitudinally here, and as those magnets rotate around the coil of copper wire, that's what generates the electricity. The electricity flows back to a power converter and system controller, and there it's turned into 60-cycle, 3-phase alternating current at 66,000 volts of electricity, very high voltage. It flows down the tower and ultimately on shore and out to the grid. There's also a mechanical braking system that comes into play here. So the turbine can be shut down by feathering the blades and engaging the braking system, and then the rotor will no longer turn. So it's very instructive to look at a power curve for a typical wind turbine. So that's what we're looking at here. On the vertical axis, we're looking at turbine power in megawatts. And along the horizontal axis, we're looking at wind speed in miles per hour. So as we go along the horizontal axis, the wind is increasing. We'll see what happens with the power. Well, you start out and there's no power, because until you get to a wind speed of about 6 to 8 miles per hour, the rotor simply isn't turning. And at about that point, all of a sudden, the rotor starts turning, and the power output increases very rapidly as the wind speed increases. In fact, it increases in proportion to the cube of the wind speed. So very quickly, the power ramps up to get to a point where it levels off. And that's typically in the range of about 20 to 25 miles per hour. What's happening here? What's happening here is you don't want the rotor to rotate any faster. And as a result, the turbine automatically begins feathering the blades and maintaining a constant rotation rate, which for the kind of wind turbines we're talking about for offshore Morro Bay project would be pretty low, like about 8 revolutions per minute. If you look at that turbine from a distance, you think it's going really slow. Well, in fact, the blades are moving, the tip of the blades are moving faster than 200 miles an hour because they're so huge. They also weigh 60 tons apiece, those blades. And so there's a lot of centrifugal force. You basically have to maintain, don't go above a certain rotation rate where the blades are in jeopardy of breaking or coming loose, in which case the whole turbine would catastrophically fail. So you can think of this as kind of being the Goldilocks zone here. The wind's not too weak, not too strong, and that's where you kind of want to be. What happens here? Well, when the wind hits about 50 miles an hour, the turbine will completely feather the blades, and the braking mechanism will be engaged, and the turbine will basically shut down. And that's basically to weather the storm. Now, this value here in the Goldilocks zone it has a particular name that's referred to as the nameplate capacity or rated capacity of the turbine. You'll hear, this is a 10 megawatt turbine or a 6 megawatt turbine. That refers to this Goldilocks zone right here. But the turbine is not always operating in that range. Sometimes the winds are low, sometimes the winds are too high, it's shut down, sometimes there's no wind at all and it's shut down. So the ratio of the long-term, for example, annual average power produced by the turbine to its nameplate capacity is called the capacity factor of the turbine. 2 important terms here, nameplate capacity and capacity factor of the turbine. The capacity factor for the turbine depends mainly on its size and the nature of the wind resource where it's sited. Larger turbines sited in areas of strong and steady winds, like offshore, generally have the highest capacity factors. And in fact, offshore wind turbines typically have a capacity factor of about 60% compared with 30 to 40% for onshore turbines. So they're 1.5 to 2 times more efficient than onshore turbines. That's one of the big attractions of moving to offshore wind. So let's take a look at the evolution of wind turbines and their over a period of time. Here to the left are land-based turbines, and to the right from here are the offshore turbines. The onshore turbines have pretty much reached their size limit. Kind of the standard right now is 2.5 megawatts. That's kind of what the turbines are down in the Salinas Valley. Now, it turns out that for a given wind speed, the power output from wind turbine is directly proportional to the area swept out by its blades. That is the rotor swept area, which is directly proportional to the square of the blade length. So bigger is better. If you double the size of the turbine, double the blade lengths, you don't get twice the power, you get 4 times the power. If you triple it, you don't get 3 times the power, you get 9 times the power. So bigger is better. And it's actually better than that because as you go to higher and higher altitudes, you're reaching up farther into the atmosphere where the winds are generally stronger and more consistent. So why don't we just build huge turbines over land and don't worry about offshore? Well, we've actually reached the limit of how big we can build turbines over land. And the reason, the limiting factor is the blade length. No one has figured out how to make a blade in more than one section. They're one continuous piece of material. And the existing 2.5 megawatt land or onshore turbines have blades that are right at the upper limit of what you can transport on the highway. You just can't transport these kind of blades that we use offshore on the highway. They're too big. It just can't be done. But the offshore wind turbines, the blades can be transported by sea. And in fact, that's exactly what's done. The factory is right at a seaport, Saint-Nazaire, France, for example. And once the blade is fabricated and ready to go, you roll it out of the factory door about 50 yards over to the ship, put it on the ship, and that's how you ship, and that's how you move it to where it needs to be. And I really want to stress the fact that these offshore wind turbines are absolutely huge. This is the Washington Monument right here, drawn to scale. The Morro Bay project will probably fall right about in here. I'm guessing 15 megawatts for the turbines there. Tower will be higher than the Washington Monument. This is the Airbus 380, world's largest airplane. It is dwarfed by the size of these offshore wind turbines. They are huge, and that is how they achieve their such high degree of efficiency. So let's talk about offshore wind turbines. They kind of fall into 2 basic categories: fixed bottom and floating. Obviously, fixed bottom are anchored to the seafloor. Floating turbines are held up by floating substructure, which is then moored to the seafloor in some fashion. Well, for California, and in fact, entire West Coast, you can forget about fixed bottom turbines. Not going to happen. The water's just too deep out here, can't do it. They only work down to about 60 meters depth. All of the wind turbines on the East Coast, all of the wind turbines, offshore wind turbines that are currently part of that energy mix I talked about earlier, they are fixed bottom turbines. That's not going to happen on the West Coast because the water is just too deep. 3 different ways of categorizing those, 3 different floating substructures: tension leg platform, spar buoy, and semi-submersible. Well, for Morro Bay, forget about tension leg platform and spar buoy. They have certain problems that are, not going to work very well there. Semi-submersible is definitely the way to go. It's almost certain that the Morro Bay wind farm will be based on the semi-submersible design, employing a catenary mooring configuration. So what's a catenary mooring configuration? Well, something like this. You've got 3 lines that come down here, and the upper half of the mooring line is synthetic rope. Then it attaches to a very heavy steel chain. The steel chain then terminates at a drag embedment anchor, which is essentially a steel plate that's angled downward and drug into the bottom by a tugboat, typically embedded about 30 feet into the ocean bottom. The total mooring line depth or length here is generally about twice the water depth. Now, the average water depth in the Morro Bay wind farm is about 3,000 feet. So the average mooring line length is going to be about a mile. So for every turbine, we're talking 3 miles of mooring line, lots of mooring line out there in the water. Now, associated with the catenary mooring, there's the concept of watch circle. They don't stay completely fixed in space. They drift around depending on the water depth. And you recognize this structure here, by the way, as being the semi-submersible design. So for the Morro Bay wind turbines, the watch circle will have a diameter of about 2 to 3 football fields. Pretty dynamic environment. So the wind's blowing out of the north, it's going to drift down to the southern part of the watch circle. The wind switches around to the south, cold front's coming through. It's going to drift back up to the northern part of the watch circle. So the turbines are going to be moving around a fair amount, and there's going to be a lot of movement below them with the mooring lines and the electrical cables. So speaking of the electrical cables, here's a typical subsurface configuration for an offshore wind farm. Now for Morro Bay, they're going to be spaced about 1 mile apart, and that's pretty typical. The spacing has to do with the size of the rotor blades here. You need to space them about 8 rotor widths apart, so the one turbine doesn't interfere with the downwind turbine. The black lines here are the mooring lines terminating or based on that catenary configuration we talked about. Here we're depicting the dynamic array cables. These are the electrical cables that carry the electricity at 66,000 volts. A typical configuration is this. It's called the lazy wave configuration. The pink part here are actually floats. So the cable is suspended in this lazy wave configuration at about mid water column. Then it goes down along the ground, and it goes to the next turbine. Ultimately, all the turbines terminate in a floating offshore substation, which gathers all the electricity together, doubles the voltage up to 132 kilovolts, and then sends that voltage ashore to an onshore substation and ultimately out to the grid. This is called the export cable. In the case of Morro Bay, there'll probably be a number of export cables. Typically, the export cables are entrenched below the seafloor. In the case of the Morro Bay project, the onshore substation is going to be the decommissioned Morro Bay power plant, a lot like the Moss Landing power plant. It has all the connections to the grid, and so that's a big advantage. Here's what a mooring line looks like. You can see it's a pretty hefty line, not the kind of line you got to go down to Home Depot and buy. The dynamic array cables are also pretty hefty. You can see this guy's holding those. And here's what a cross section of the dynamic array cable looks like. These the 3 conductors here carrying the 3 phases of the electricity, heavily insulated, heavily armored. This little dot right here is actually a fiber optic cable. So the wind turbines can talk to each other. Commands can be sent to them from shore-based center to tell them to shut down or whatever. But to a great extent, the wind turbines operate autonomously. They adjust the wind. They will shut down on high winds. They do all those things autonomously. But and they send back information about their status of their maintenance and so forth. But they can be controlled remotely from shore via this fiber optic cable connection. This is an artist's conception of what a floating offshore substation would look like. The one for Morro Bay will probably be a lot like this, but probably much larger than what's depicted here in this picture. So what are the port and infrastructure requirements to field a floating offshore wind farm? Well, they're pretty substantial. You need a wharf with room for a turbine and substructure assembly, because basically you're putting it together right there at the waterfront. And that would be about 2,000 feet of waterfront access, about 6,000 pounds per square foot of pier strength, so pretty hefty pier, because you're assembling the components right here at the wharf side. You need a crane, a big crane, 700 feet height, 1,000-ton lift capacity, because you got to basically stack the components of the tower together. You got to put the blades in place right there at the waterfront. You need an upland yard, about a couple hundred acres for storage of turbine components, fabrication of substructure. Of course, you need access to open sea. And that means not only a deep channel, deep enough to tow the assembled turbine, but also no overhead obstruction. So you can't be, for example, this disqualifies the Port of Oakland as being a place where you might field these turbines, because they simply wouldn't fit under the Oakland Bay Bridge. They would fit under the Golden Gate Bridge, but just barely, the kind of turbines we're talking about here. We would also need moorage for access vessels, tugboats, crew access vessels, and so forth, shown here, because ultimately you're going to tow this thing out with tugboats and then anchor it in place. A nearby airfield for helicopter access would also be good, because this is a pretty typical way that service is done on these systems. Helicopter flies the service crew out, drops them off on the top of the turbine here. They go down through a hatch and do whatever maintenance they need to do inside the nacelle, or you can come up with a crew access boat here and then climb the tower here and do the service that way. This is pretty common in Europe, using helicopter access for maintenance. What's it cost to field such a system, and how does that cost break out? Well, pretty much three components comprise about 3/4 of it. The cost of the turbines is about 24%. The substructure and foundation, actually it would be the floating, substructure, about 26%. Electrical infrastructure here. Surprisingly, the assembly installation is actually pretty small, only about 8.2%. So what's the Morro Bay farm going to cost? Well, I'm making an estimate here of about $20 billion total implementation cost. And that's pretty high, $20 billion. That's comparable to a very large nuclear power plant. But this system is going to produce the power comparable to a very large nuclear power plant. By the way, in terms of the port requirements, I'm making a guess, and I think it's a pretty good guess, that Port Hueneme is going to be the staging area for this wind farm. Port Hueneme is about 40 miles south of Santa Barbara. And I think it meets all the criteria that we were talking about prior there. It's about 150 nautical miles away from Morro Bay wind farm area, but that's close enough. If Port Hueneme doesn't work, then I think you're going then all the way down to Long Beach. As I mentioned before, Oakland will not make it because of the problem with the bridge access. So let's talk about costs now. What we're looking at here is in 2020, it's a global average of levelized cost of energy by source in cents per kilowatt hour. So what is LCOE? You may or might have heard this before. It's an important parameter. LCOE can be regarded as the minimum constant price at which electricity must be sold in order to break even over the lifetime of a power plant. It's sort of the cradle to grave measure of the cost per unit of power that allows comparison of different power sources. It includes implementation, operations, maintenance, and even decommissioning costs of a power plant. So you can see the cheapest power right now is onshore wind. Onshore wind turbines are producing power, a global average of about 4.6 cents per kilowatt hour. That's the cheapest power in the history of the world. There's never been a time in the history of the world where power has been cheaper than that. Followed pretty close by solar. Solar at some point very likely is going to overtake wind and become the cheapest because the cost of solar is dropping and dropping. And then natural gas, geothermal, offshore wind. Notice offshore wind is right now about twice as expensive as onshore wind. So we're going to come back and talk about that. Coal, you can see why coal is a dying industry. And finally, nuclear, sticking out like a sore thumb. Nuclear power is by far the most expensive on the grid and getting more expensive. That's why nuclear is a dying industry, as is coal. So why is offshore wind so expensive and what's happening there? Well, the reason why it's so expensive is because there's not much of it out there. It has not yet achieved the economy of scale associated with onshore wind. As offshore wind farms are built out to utility scale, which is defined as about 600 megawatts or greater, their cost will decrease. In fact, data presented by the special the SIOW report that Kristen distributed here, hot off the press, implies a levelized cost of energy of about 3 cents per kilowatt hour for offshore wind by 2030. So the price will go down as it is built out. So I want now to talk a little bit about the floating offshore wind farms. There's offshore wind farms, and as we talked about before, they're fixed and floating. The floating offshore wind farms are a very small fraction right now of the total offshore wind farms, but they are the ones that are most relevant to us because the Morro Bay project, and indeed all offshore wind projects along the coast of California, are going to be based on floating architecture. So what's the experience out there now? Well, there's really only 2 operational floating wind farms out there in the world. I mean, there are individual one-off floating wind turbines that are sort of being prototyped by the Japanese, by the Chinese, by various countries. But those are sort of R&D platforms. There's really only 2 operational floating wind farms in the world. The first is called Hywind Scotland. It was the world's first large-scale floating wind farm deployed off the coast of Scotland in 2017. It has only 5 turbines, but it produces about 30 megawatts of electricity. By the way, I'm using this term megawatts a lot. Here's a good point of reference. 1 megawatt is enough electricity to support about 650 average size homes. So every time you think megawatt, think 650 homes. The second one is called Wind Float Atlantic. It was deployed off the coast of Portugal in 2020. It has 3 floating wind turbines, and you recognize the semi-submersible structure here, producing 25 megawatts of electricity. These systems are going to be dwarfed by the Morro Bay project, as you'll see coming up. These are going to be down in the noise level when we fully build out Morro Bay. So let's now talk about specifics of the planned Morro Bay wind farm. First of all, where is it? Well, this is it right here. Really, the wind farm is this hatched area. There's a couple different colors here, and there's this area right here. Don't pay any attention to that. Really, the area that has these horizontal diagonal hashes here, that is the area that was recently approved by the Biden administration. First of all, it's not really off Morro Bay. It's north of Morro Bay. It's really off Big Sur, between Lucia and Cambria, about 20 to 30 miles out. It's called the Morro Bay Wind Farm because the power is going to come ashore at Morro Bay, but it's really north of Morro Bay. And here's my guesstimate of what it's going to be all about. And when I say guesstimate, we don't know yet because no company has yet, won the lease. No company has yet been given a permit. No company has yet come forward with a plan. But it's pretty easy to take a look at this and take a look at the technology and come up with a pretty good estimate of what it's going to be like. So here's what I expect it's going to be like. I think it's going to consist of about 375 wind turbines spaced about a mile apart, each with a nameplate capacity of 14 megawatts. Now that's pretty conservative because by the time this thing is fielded, right now, the only commercial offshore wind turbines you can buy are 12 megawatts, but there are being prototyped 16 and even 18 megawatt turbines that'll probably become on the market in a few years. So I think 14 megawatts is actually pretty conservative. By the time this thing is deployed by the end of this decade, we might be talking 16 or even 18 megawatts, but I'm taking a conservative viewpoint here. We're generating up to 200 amps of 60 cycle 3-phase AC at 66 kilovolts for each turbine. So that tells you that the total nameplate capacity for the system will be about 5.25 gigawatts, which completely dwarfs everything that's out there now. I mean, it will be huge. To put that in context, and then that's the nameplate capacity, but with a capacity factor of about 0.6, remember what that was earlier, that means the wind farm will produce about 3.15 gigawatts of power in the long-term average, making it the highest capacity power plant in the state of California. You've probably heard about the Diablo Canyon nuclear power plant, the last nuclear power plant in California. It's going to be fully decommissioned in 2025. This power plant, this Morro Bay offshore wind power plant, will produce about 1.5 times the power of Diablo Canyon. So it's comparable to a very large nuclear power plant. And it will produce enough electricity to power about 2 million homes in the long term. And I'm estimating the cost of electricity will be about 5 cents per kilowatt hour. It could be lower by then. And then finally, from a climate change perspective, the key point here, it will prevent the emission of over 300 million tons of CO2 into the atmosphere over the course of its 25-year design life cycle as it replaces gas-fired power plants. So what's the timeline of this? So here's a rough timeline, and I stress the word rough here because I made up a lot of this stuff here. Well, first of all, the project was approved by the Biden administration in 2021, just a few months ago. And what will happen next is in 2022, the Department of the Interior, acting through the Bureau of Ocean Energy Management, will auction off rights to develop the wind farm. And as I understand it, there are 14 companies currently expressing interest. And that will be followed by the design and permitting phase. I'm assuming a 4-year period for that, but it could be as long as 7 years if you look at what's happened on some of the wind farms on the East Coast. What happens during the design and permitting phase is the companies come forward and make public what they plan to do. This is how many turbines we're going to put out there. This is what the size are going to be. All the things I just talked about, they basically put out that design for public comment. The public weighs in. There's going to be lawsuits because people are going to say, don't do this. That has to work through the court system. Companies may have to go back and redesign and come forth with some accommodations and so forth. But at some point, hopefully, it gets through that process and the deployment begins. If that works through in 4 years, then deployment would begin in 2027. That may be optimistic. I'm estimating it would take about 3 years to build it out. And that means it would be complete and fully operational in the power grid by about 2030, the end of this decade. The design life of these wind turbines is 25 years. So beginning at about 2052, you would start replacing the turbines with new technology. So possible issues of concern, and I've got a lot of material on this, but in the interest of time, I'm not going to go through it. I'm just going to kind of give you a very quick overview here. The way I see it, there are 4 areas of concern: impact on commercial fishing, impact on whales and dolphins, impact on seabirds, impact on the Big Sur viewshed. Impact on commercial fishing. Well, commercial fishing is going to be banned within this wind farm. So the commercial fishermen are being asked to give up 399 square miles of what would otherwise be prime fishing area. Not surprisingly, they are against it. The California Federation of Fishermen's Associations, which is like a blanket umbrella organization representing all the fishermen's associations in California, has come out in strong opposition to this wind farm. I'm sure there will be lawsuits. Let me say a few things about that, about fishermen. I have a great respect for fishermen. They put food on our table and they pursue a very dangerous profession. And their voices need to be heard. Their voices will be heard. And we'll see how that plays out. Second area of concern is impact on whales and dolphins. And there are a couple of concerns there. You know, there's sound. There's going to be sound emanating from these wind turbines because there's mechanical sound as things are moving and vibrating. There's also a lot of electricity being carried in the cables. I've looked into that pretty carefully, and I don't claim to be an expert on whales and dolphins. Let me tell you, there's a lot of world-class whale experts in our area. I'm not one of them, but I have looked into those issues, and what I conclude there is not going to be a problem, not going to be harmful to the whales in any regard. It's also situated far enough offshore that most of the gray whale migration is occurring inshore of this wind farm. Now, doesn't mean whales aren't going to find their way into this wind farm. That's absolutely inevitable that at some point whales, stray whale here or there is going to find him or her in the middle of this wind farm, and they are going to be impacted by they're going to hear the sound. I don't believe they're going to sense the magnetic field or electric field from the cables. So I don't think it's going to be a big problem. Second area of concern is impact on seabirds. There are millions of seabirds living off the coast of California. Many of them would have the habitat in this area. Wind turbines kill birds. There's no doubt about that. But there is technology out there to minimize that. And I'm sure that technology will be proposed and applied for the Morro Bay project. Also, the air gap, the distance we were talking about before between the sea surface and the tip of the blade here is typically going to be about, I think about 150 feet or so for the wind turbines in Morro Bay. And most seabirds are staying pretty close to the surface because that's where their food source is. So many seabirds will simply fly under these turbines. So I think that's going to be okay. And the key point here is the Audubon Society has come out in strong support of offshore wind because they recognize that climate change is killing many, many birds every year. And they see offshore wind as being an important part of dealing with climate change. The organizations that are the whale advocacy groups, I'll call them, for example, the Cetacean Society, Greenpeace, Sea Shepherds, they have, as far as I can tell, they have not yet weighed in on this issue of offshore wind and whales and dolphins. So it'll be interesting to see what their take is on this. And finally, impact on the Big Sur viewshed. Will you be able to see these turbines from shore? The answer is yes. Under optimum viewing conditions from the highway down in Big Sur, optimum viewing conditions means a really clear day. And you're in the morning where there's no glare off the ocean. Yes, you will be able to see these turbines, but you're going to have to look really hard. They're going to appear as specks on the horizon. And with a modest pair of binoculars, you'll actually be able to see you'll be able to make out the rotors turning. But with the unaided eye, they will appear as specks on the horizon only under optimum viewing conditions. On a hazy day, you won't see them. In the afternoon, even on a clear day, you won't see them. So I don't think that's going to be an issue. It's going to bother some people, but I don't think that's going to be a showstopper in any way. So let me now jump to the summary, and that'll give us plenty of time for Q&A. We face a climate crisis that is growing worse by the year. We're in the middle of it right now. We're seeing it all around us. Offshore wind power is a key technology for reducing CO2 emissions and mitigating this crisis. The Morro Bay offshore wind farm was recently approved by the Biden administration. Deployment of this massive wind farm will likely begin in about 6 years and be completed by 2030, when it will become the largest capacity power plant in all of California and provide enough carbon-free electricity to power at least 2 million average-sized homes and prevent the emission of over 300 million tons of CO2 into the atmosphere over its 25-year design life. Although there are areas of concern, in my judgment, none of these concerns are showstoppers for this project. Now, others may come to a different judgment on that, and that is fine. And part of what I like to do in these talks is to identify those issues and get them out on the table so people can think about it. And other people may come to a different judgment than me. But I personally believe that the Morro Bay wind farm should be deployed and that its successful implementation will serve as a model for other offshore wind projects in the US and around the world aimed at fighting climate change. So that's it. I'm going to now stop the screen share here and open it up for questions.
Thank you so much, Mike. That was fantastic. I learned a lot.
Thank you. Thanks a lot.
I do want to open it up for questions, and I do see a handful of students in there. So if any of the students especially have questions, please either raise your hand or go ahead and type it into the chat. And what we'll do is, again, given the size of the group, I think you can just unmute yourself and turn your video on to ask the questions. I'm going to kick it off with a question.
Sure.
In terms of the impacts that you noted. I know there were some questions within the last few years of the impact of a wind farm, a West Coast wind farm, on the Navy and DoD use of the area.
Yes.
So I wondered if you could add a little bit about that.
Yes, the Navy was the last government agency to hold out. And, they were holding out for a long time on this because they didn't want to give up the training area. You're not going to be able to have a submarine transit through this region. And that's because, we saw the schematics here of all the cables and the mooring lines in the water where you're just not going to be able to sail a submarine through there. You're not going to be able to tow a sonar array through there. The Navy was reluctant to give up the training area. And I absolutely get that. But they eventually did. They were the last group to basically give it the go-ahead. And once that happened, the Biden administration moved pretty quickly through the Department of the Interior. Secretary Holland made the announcement. State of California also got involved, and Governor Newsom was, appearing at the news conference to, give his endorsement to it as well. But yeah, it will have an impact on Navy training.
Great, thank you. And Scott Giles, do you want to ask your question? So he's got a question in the chat. Oh, he has no mic. Okay, great. What if maintenance costs exceed profits?
Well, the maintenance costs are actually pretty low on this. And, the thing to work to understand here is the companies that are bidding on this are in it to make a profit. And there's no doubt about that. And so, they're not in it to lose money. They're not in it to take money from the government. They're in it to turn a profit. And, there's a lot of experience out there so far with, particularly in Europe, because there's a lot of wind farms out there. They're mostly the fixed bottom wind farms, but the turbines are the same. And they're profitable. And so I have no reason to expect that this wind farm won't be profitable.
And Joe, would you like to unmute yourself and ask your question? This is one of our NPS students and also a Barrow Fellow for this year.
Okay.
Hi, thank you. Yeah, I just typed it in the chat, but was curious, we've been talking about some of the naval and other military bases that are susceptible to changes in climate, particularly sea rise in this case. How vulnerable is Port Hueneme and the Morro base site? Is there consideration of investment in that large and costly infrastructure that may be short-lived depending on the location? Thank you.
Yeah, that's a good question. I don't think Port Hueneme is that vulnerable. Generally speaking, if you look at sea level rise, one thing about sea level rise that a lot of people don't know, but I'm sure you folks probably know this, and that is it's not uniform spatially. As the sea level rises, it rises at a different rate in different parts of the world. Along the west coast of California, we're kind of pretty close to the long-term average. So when you look at global mean sea level, that's about how fast sea level will be rising off the coast of California. So there are other areas that are much more vulnerable. For example, Norfolk. Along the East Coast, the sea level is going to be rising faster, significantly faster, and along the Gulf Coast, significantly faster than the global mean average. And that's because the Gulf Stream system is weakening. And as the Gulf Stream weakens, the ocean circulation changes. That's what causes this variation in sea level rise. So California is not, as susceptible to sea level rise as, for example, the East Coast and Norfolk. Now, that doesn't mean Portland might not have problems. If you look at the time rate of sea level rise, it really is expected to take off by about 2050. And what really causes it to accelerate beginning around 2050, about the middle of the century, is the Antarctic ice shelf starting to melt significantly faster in that time frame. So that's a good question. I think it's going to be okay. And in the 2015 beyond timeframe, there may have to be some mitigation going on there, but I don't see that as a showstopper. Good question, though.
Thank you. Thanks for your answer.
Mm-hmm.
Thanks, Mike and Joe. JJ, you want to ask your question?
Yeah, Mike. I was just wondering if there's any plans.
Hi, JJ. Good to see you.
Hey, Mike. How you doing?
I didn't know you were on.
I just wonder if there are any plans to, have some sort of monitoring systems in here to measure the actual impacts. You mentioned the potential of impacts on seabirds and marine mammals and things like that. And I was just wondering if there's any plans to have monitoring systems to kind of keep track of what it actually does, a wind farm like this would.
Yeah, that's a great question. I'm almost certain there will be. In fact, when we get into that permitting phase, it seems likely that, when people are going to come forward and say, let's don't do this because we worry about the impact on seabirds or marine mammals. I'm sure part of the negotiation back the other way will be, we'll monitor it. And if things are birds are being killed at a too high of a rate or we're seeing an impact on marine mammals, then we'll take steps at that point. So I'm pretty sure that will be part of the negotiation process. There will be a negotiation process going on. One idea that's been floated in one of these talks, and I think was a good one, is, well, why not have a pilot project where, for a period of 1 or 2 years, you put out a small subset of the wind farm and then measure the impact on the environment and on marine life and so forth. So that also is a possibility. I think all of these possibilities are going to be on the table during that permitting phase. The public will have ample opportunity to comment. The public will have ample opportunity to join in lawsuits and to force the issues. And I think, stay tuned. There's going to be a lot going on there.
Thanks.
Mm-hmm.
Great, thank you. I have one other question while we wait for anybody to type some more questions into the chat. And that has to do with I know we've gotten a lot of lessons learned out of Europe. They're ahead of us on this.
Mm-hmm.
I wondered if there are lessons learned from the East Coast, especially in terms of going through this process, because you talk about, we still have public input to go through. And so there's a whole variety of stages in the US, but I wonder if there were any lessons learned from the East Coast and the wind farms that are showing up there.
Yeah, well, the only lesson I can think of is it's a difficult process. I'm making the optimistic viewpoint. We're going to get it done in 4 years, but typically on the East Coast, it took about 7 years to get these projects approved. A lot of pushback, a lot of heartburn. The same kind of things we're seeing here. There was issues about view shed. People, don't want to look out there and see a wind turbine. Now, in our case, it's going to be pretty far out. Many of the turbines off the East Coast, particularly in New England states, they're pretty close in. You see them. They're right there. Has an impact on the view shed. Big impact on fishermen. The fishermen, just like the fishermen off California, they were not happy about it. And it's not just the idea of giving up the fishing area within the wind farm, but also transit. They have to kind of go around the wind farm if they want to get farther offshore. So those kinds of issues, navigation. So I guess the one takeaway I can give you on that is difficult process. It's going to be a difficult process, and there's going to be a lot of public outcry, both for and against this thing. It's going to be an interesting time.
And Joe, can you unmute? Those are some good questions you've got there in the chat.
Yes, me again. Another question regarding security and threat mitigation. Obviously, and I'm no expert. I think oil platforms relatively, smaller space, but this wind farm is going to extend. I forget the square mileage. And as critical infrastructure, what's the security method proposed? Is that a Department of Energy, Coast Guard kind of hybrid force? Would it be a contracted security? Is there going to be a buffer zone that allows a cordon that's, another mile within? Just what are the thoughts on that? Thank you.
Yeah, that's a really good question. Chris and I actually talked about that in an earlier discussion. The interesting thing about this, the wind farm is outside of U.S. territorial waters. Our territorial waters extend out 12 miles. Our EEZ extends out 200 miles. At least that's what we claim under the law of the sea treaty, although we've never signed or certainly never ratified the law of the sea treaty, and that's an issue. So you worry a little bit about that. Talking with Christians, he said, well, it's kind of been grandfathered in because no countries have challenged our ability to claim those distances under the law of the sea treaty. But yes, it's out there, and I think the Coast Guard would have to play a role here. Even the U.S. Navy would have to play a role here. People have asked me before, what if China comes in and says they want to, they come in and they do something to damage this thing, maybe covertly. And my answer is, well, that's why you have a U.S. Coast Guard. That's why you have a U.S. Navy. So that is a concern. I also worry about the cybersecurity of this system. I'm hoping that it will be, completely autonomous and off the internet, because the software is not complicated. It would be easy to, certainly not inconceivable that a hacker could come in there and play around with the software and cause the wind farm to become damaged. That kind of thing, it certainly has to be a concern. But yeah, I think it does open up an emission or expanded role for the Coast Guard to play in that area, and potentially even the U.S. Navy.
Thank you again.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, great question and great points, Mike. And I think especially with the increased role as well in the Arctic, the Coast Guard and the Navy and that kind of hybrid, the collaboration there is going to be important as we go forward.
Yep.
So we're closing in on the end of the hour. So I do want to open it up for anybody else that's got any questions. Okay, I'm going to start to wrap things up here. Mike, thank you so much. Just so much detail in your slides, really appreciated. And I think I know I have a better sense of what is proposed out there and the process that we'll all go through. We'd love to kind of have you back as this goes forward, maybe in a year or two, and hear from you again on the process. I do want to encourage folks, we'll have Mike's video put on our events page for the Climate Security Network website. We'll put that on in the next day or two. And I believe, Mike, you have some other presentations that are longer, maybe closer to the 60 to 75-minute presentations online as well.
Yeah, I have a YouTube channel, and you can just go to YouTube, and it's called Climate Change Matters with Mike Clancy. You just go to YouTube, search on Mike Clancy Climate, and you should come to it. And I've got a whole bunch of pure climate talks on there, but also some that are pretty similar to this one, but in more detail and longer if you want to really delve into those areas of concern.
Great, thank you. And the Energy Academic Group has a handful of resources too. So what I'll do is I'll pull together some of those links and send them out to the Climate Security Network email list. If you're not on that list, feel free to, and you want to join, feel free to send me an email. I'll type my email into the chat really quickly here. But thank you again, Mike. We really appreciate your expertise, and thanks everybody for participating.
Well, thanks for inviting me, Kristen. I really enjoyed it, and great questions and great group there.
Wonderful. And thanks, everybody. I do want to thank Douglas Van Bossett, who hosted us here on Zoom today, and also Jeff Paduin again, Dean Paduin, for setting us up. So thanks, everybody, and take care. We'll stop recording now.
Bye.